There is a distinct, sickening moment when the realization hits you that you are truly lost. It doesn't happen all at once. It creeps up on you, masquerading as a minor inconvenience, until it violently flips your stomach and drops your core temperature by 10 degrees. I consider myself an experienced hiker. Not an expert, maybe, but I had a dozen solo trips under my belt. That was my first mistake. Complacency. It was late October, and I had decided to tackle a rugged, heavily wooded stretch of the deep backcountry in the Cascades. The air was crisp, biting at my nose, but the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy of ancient, moss-draped pines kept the worst of the autumn chill at bay. I was supposed to do a simple 12-mile loop. About 6 miles in, I saw a rock formation jutting out through the dense tree line. It looked like the perfect vantage point for a photo, maybe 50 yards off the main trail. I stepped off the beaten dirt path, pushing through a thicket of dry brush and dead ferns. I took my pictures, drank some water, and turned back. But the trail wasn't there. I walked what I thought was 50 yards in a straight line, nothing but endless, identical trunks of pine and fir, their bark dark and damp. I checked my phone. No signal. Just the mocking, searching icon draining my battery. I told myself to stay calm. I walked a wider grid, searching for the familiar worn earth or a trail marker. Minutes bled into an hour, then 2 hours. The terrain grew steeper, more unfamiliar, choked with deadfalls and thick, thorny undergrowth that tore at my hiking pants. Then the true horror of the woods began. The sun dipped below the jagged mountain ridge, and the forest didn't just get dark, it died. The temperature plummeted instantaneously, the crisp air turning into a freezing, wet slap against my exposed face. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, twisting the trees into skeletal, looming shapes. The silence became absolute, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the frantic crunching of my own boots against the dead leaves. I was wearing a light fleece jacket, entirely unprepared for a sub-freezing night in the wilderness. Hypothermia wasn't just a possibility, it was a guarantee if I stopped moving. Panic, raw and primal, clawed at my chest. I was practically running blindly now, stumbling over exposed roots, my flashlight beam cutting a frantic, shaky tunnel through the encroaching pitch black. Just as the numbness in my fingers became painful, my flashlight beam caught something unnatural. Straight lines. In a dense forest, there are no perfect right angles. I pushed through a thick wall of evergreens and stumbled into a small, suffocating clearing. Sitting in the center of it, swallowed by the creeping dark, was a cabin. It was a rotting, dilapidated structure, barely standing. The wood was black with age and rot, the roof sagging heavily in the middle like a broken spine. Thick, thorny vines crawled up the sides, attempting to drag the whole thing back into the earth. There was no glass in the single front window, just a jagged black square staring out into the woods like an empty eye socket. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. It was terrifying. Every instinct in my body screamed to stay away from it, a deep guttural warning ringing in my ears. But a violent shiver racked my spine, and I could barely feel my toes. The cold was going to kill me tonight. I had no choice. I gripped my heavy metal flashlight like a weapon, walked up the rotting wooden steps, and pushed against the heavy front door. It shrieked in protest, scraping against the warped floorboards, and swung open into the pitch black. I stepped inside, grateful for the immediate block from the freezing wind. But as my flashlight beam swept across the room, and I took my first breath of the stagnant air inside, my stomach violently dropped. It didn't smell like dust and abandoned rot. It smelled like raw, decaying meat. The metallic, sickly sweet odor hit the back of my throat like a physical blow. It was a thick, cloying stench, a horrifying cocktail of rusted iron, damp earth, and something undeniably dead and putrefying. I gagged, my free hand flying to my mouth, pulling the collar of my thin fleece up over my nose to filter the foul air. The wind howled outside, a harsh reminder of the freezing death waiting for me in the trees, forcing me to swallow down my nausea and stay put. I stood frozen just inside the doorway, my hand trembling so violently that the beam of my heavy flashlight danced erratically across the interior. It was a single, cramped room, maybe 15 by 15 feet. The floorboards were spongy and bowed under my weight, slick with some unidentified grime. As I swept the light from left to right, the illusion of an abandoned ruin instantly shattered. This place was occupied. In the far corner lay a filthy, stained mattress, stripped of any sheets, surrounded by crumpled balls of newspaper and empty, rust-eaten tin cans. Above it, crude, jagged holes in the walls had been stuffed with dry moss and rags to keep out the draft. But it was the opposite wall that made my blood run cold. Hanging from rusted nails driven deep into the rotting timber was a collection of tools. They weren't standard logging equipment. There were heavily chipped hatchets, a rusted wood saw with dark flakes crusting its teeth, and thick coils of dirty, heavy-duty chain. They looked less like tools for survival and more like instruments of malice. The beam of my light caught a dull gleam on the floor beneath them, a massive, heavy iron bear trap, its serrated jaws clamped tightly shut. My breath hitched, creating small, rapid clouds of vapor in the frigid air. I told myself it was just a poacher's cabin, some off-the-grid hermit scraping by on whatever they could trap. It was illegal, sure, but it didn't mean they were a monster. I just needed to survive the night. I cautiously pushed the heavy front door shut behind me, wincing at the loud, agonizing scrape of wood on wood. It didn't have a lock, just a crude metal latch that didn't fully catch on the frame. I turned my attention to the center of the room, drawn by the epicenter of the rotting stench. A heavy makeshift wooden table sat there, its surface scarred by deep, frantic gouges. Piled upon it was a chaotic mess of dried animal hides and bones. Large bones. Rib cages and femurs snapped violently in half, the marrow scraped clean. Dark, tacky puddles of coagulated blood stained the wood. A few lethargic blowflies buzzed weakly in the freezing air, disturbed by my light. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The overwhelming urge to flee back into the pitch-black forest warred with the rational knowledge that I would freeze to death within hours. I decided I would huddle in the corner nearest the door, stay awake, and bolt the second the sun crested the horizon. I swept my flashlight toward the corner opposite the filthy mattress, looking for a clear spot to sit. The beam swept past a pile of dirty tarps, but then it caught a flash of unnatural modern color, bright, synthetic neon orange. I hesitated, then took a slow, agonizing step closer, keeping the light pinned to the spot. It was a high-end Osprey hiking backpack, the kind you buy at an outdoor retailer for a small fortune. It had been violently slashed open down the middle. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. As I stepped closer, my boot kicked something soft. I pointed the light down. It was a sleeping bag, heavily stained with large, dark brown patches. And scattered in the dirt beside it, reflecting the beam of my flashlight, was a small, messy pile of laminated plastic cards. With a trembling hand, I knelt down and picked the top one up. It was a Washington State driver's license belonging to a young woman. I wiped the grime off the plastic with my thumb. In the harsh glare of the flashlight, her smiling face looked back at me. I dropped the card as if it had burned me. As it fluttered to the floor, my flashlight beam swept over the dark, rusted cast-iron wood stove sitting just a few feet away. I hadn't noticed it in the shadows. I froze. Through the small, soot-caked vents in the iron door, I could see the faint, dim orange glow of dying embers. I took a step toward it and held out my bare hand. The heavy iron was radiating a distinct, localized heat. Whoever lived here hadn't abandoned this cabin decades ago. They hadn't even left days ago. They had been standing in this exact room mere hours, maybe minutes, before I arrived. The heat radiating from the iron didn't warm me. It sent a shard of ice straight through my veins. I snatched my hand back as if the metal had bitten me. The faint orange glow of the embers suddenly felt like a ticking clock. Someone was coming back, and based on the slashed Osprey bag, the scattered IDs, and the chains on the wall, they weren't going to offer me directions to the highway. They were going to kill me. My first instinct was blind flight. I spun around, my flashlight wildly illuminating dust motes in the stagnant air, and lunged for the door. My hand gripped the crude iron latch, ready to throw it open and sprint back into the labyrinth of deadfalls and thorns. But a brutal gust of wind slammed the exterior walls, whistling through the cracks and biting my exposed neck. The reality of my situation crashed down on me with suffocating weight. It was 20 degrees outside and dropping fast. If I ran blindly into the pitch-black woods with only a dying flashlight, the elements would claim me before I made it a mile. Out there was certain death. In here was a slim chance. I had to make this place a fortress. I had to make it so whoever lived here couldn't get inside until daylight, when I could at least see where I was running. I shoved the heavy wooden door completely shut. It didn't fit flush against the frame. There was a half-inch gap running down the side where the wood had warped. I frantically scanned the room for a lock or a deadbolt. There was only a flimsy, rusted hook and eye latch that looked like it would snap under a firm kick. I slid the hook into place with a trembling hand. It wasn't nearly enough. I turned to the center of the room, the butchering table. It was constructed from thick slabs of raw timber and had to weigh at least 150 pounds. I shoved my flashlight into my jacket pocket, leaving the room illuminated only by a muffled, bouncing beam of light through the fabric, and gripped the edge of the table. The wood was sticky. I tried not to think about what I was touching as I planted my boots on the spongy floorboards and heaved. The table groaned, its thick legs scraping agonizingly loud against the floor. Every screech of wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent cabin. I prayed whoever was out there was far enough away not to hear it. Muscle by agonizing muscle, I dragged the monstrosity across the small room and wedged it violently against the door. I grabbed the blood-stained mattress next, ignoring the putrid smell, and shoved it on top of the table to muffle any impact. I stood back, chest heaving, my breath pluming in the freezing air. It was a pathetic barricade, but it was all I had. Then I realized my flashlight was acting like a beacon. If they were walking back through the woods, the light bleeding through the cracks in the empty window frame would tell them exactly where I was. I pulled the heavy metal cylinder from my pocket. My thumb hovered over the rubber button. Turning it off meant surrendering to the absolute void. It meant sitting in the pitch black with the smell of rotting meat and a predator's trophies. But leaving it on was a death sentence. I clicked it off. The darkness that swallowed the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against my eyeballs. I backed slowly into the corner furthest from the door in the window, sliding down the rough wooden wall until I hit the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, shivering violently, straining my ears against the howling wind outside. Minutes dragged into an eternity. My eyes played tricks on me, conjuring phantom shapes in the blackness. The cold was seeping through my thin pants, numbing my legs. And then the wind died down for just a fraction of a second. In that brief window of silence, I heard it, about 20 yards away, just beyond the tree line. Crunch. A heavy, deliberate footstep snapping a dry branch, then another and another. Someone was circling the cabin.
Crunch. Pause. Crunch. The rhythm was agonizingly slow. Deer move with a skittish, erratic grace. Bears lumber with heavy, continuous momentum, snapping brush without a second thought. But this was calculated. This was the deliberate, bipedal stride of a predator taking its time, silently assessing its territory. Every time a heavy boot pressed into the frozen dead leaves, a fresh wave of adrenaline scorched through my veins, temporarily overriding the freezing ambient temperature of the room. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing both hands brutally hard over my own mouth to muffle the sound of my ragged, panicked breathing. Trapped in a sensory void without my flashlight, I had to rely entirely on my hearing. The darkness amplified everything, making every snapping twig outside sound like a cracking whip. The footsteps moved out of the tree line and into the small clearing. The harsh crunch of dry leaves transitioned into the softer, muffled thud of boots compressing frozen dirt. They were getting closer. 10 yards. 5 yards. Then they stopped. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed was infinitely worse than the footsteps. My mind raced, painting horrifying pictures in the pitch-black void of the cabin. Were they standing right outside the door? Were they looking down at the frantic, muddy tracks my boots had just carved into their front step? A sudden, abrasive scrape against the exterior wall sent a violent jolt of pure electricity through my spine. It sounded like something hard, a hunting knife or thick, grimy fingernails dragging slowly across the rotting timber. Scrape, scuff, scrape. Whoever it was, they were trailing their hand along the side of the cabin, walking a tight perimeter. The walls were so thin and decayed that I can actually feel the faint rhythmic vibration of their touch reverberating through the floorboards beneath me. I crab-walked backward, sliding as silently as possible across the filthy, spongy wood until my spine hit the opposite corner, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the thin wooden planks as I could. The dragging sound continued along the side wall, moving methodically toward the front of the cabin, toward the door. I stared blindly into the darkness, my eyes straining so hard against the blackness that they ached. Suddenly, the metal latch on the door rattled. It wasn't a gentle, inquiring test. It was a violent, abrupt clack, clack, clack of iron hitting iron as the handle was jerked upward. The thick wooden door bowed inward slightly, hitting the heavy butchering table I had wedged against it. The table groaned loudly in protest, a sickening screech of wood echoing in the cramped space, but the makeshift barricade held its ground. A low, wet grunt vibrated from the other side of the wood. It was a deeply human sound, but completely devoid of any humanity or warmth. It was the sound of raw, feral frustration. I clamped my hands tighter over my mouth, tears of pure, primal terror stinging my freezing cheeks. "Please leave," I begged silently in the dark. "Think it's just swollen shut from the cold. Please just walk away." Instead, the heavy boots stepped away from the door, moving a few feet to the right. My stomach plummeted into a bottomless gorge. To the right of the door was the single window. I had been in such a blind, adrenaline-fueled panic to block the entrance that I hadn't even thought to find something to cover the gaping, jagged square in the wall. Through the glassless frame, the faint, bruised purple hue of the night sky offered the only meager contrast to the pitch-black room. The footsteps stopped directly beneath the window. For a terrifying, agonizing second, nothing happened. Then the faint purple light of the night sky was abruptly eclipsed as a massive, hulking silhouette rose up, completely blocking the open frame. And then I heard it. A deep, wet, rhythmic snorting sound. The heavy silhouette was leaning its head into the open window, taking long, deliberate breaths. They were smelling the air inside the cabin.
The rhythmic, wet snuffing sound through the glassless window was the most horrifying thing I had ever heard. It wasn't the aggressive, tearing sniff of a wild animal. It was the slow, calculating inhalation of a human taking inventory. The putrid stench of the cabin, the rotting meat, the stale iron of blood was entirely their own making. What they were smelling for was me. I squeezed my eyes shut, my chest burning from holding my breath so long. I didn't dare move a muscle. I prayed my scent, masked by the overwhelming foulness of the room and the freezing air, wouldn't betray me. The massive silhouette remained frozen in the window frame, a hulking mass of darkness blocking the meager ambient light from the night sky.
For what felt like an eternity, the only sound was the wind whipping through the pines and that deep, deliberate breathing. Every inhalation sounded like a wet sponge being squeezed. Then, the breathing stopped. The silhouette slowly turned its head. It wasn't looking blindly into the pitch-black room. It was looking directly at the floor, right at the frantic, muddy boot prints I had tracked in when I bolted through the door. I knew it. The cold dread pooled in my stomach, turning to lead. My panic had left a neon sign pointing straight to the corner where I sat huddled. A low, guttural chuckle rumbled from the window. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was a dark, private acknowledgement, the sound of a hunter realizing their prey had willingly walked into the trap. The silhouette abruptly dropped from the window frame, the purple sky reappearing like a sudden, faint bruise in the darkness. The heavy boots stepped back from the wall. The sickening realization washed over me. The element of surprise was completely gone. They knew I was inside. I pressed myself so hard against the rotting timber of the corner that a rusted nail-head bit painfully into my shoulder through my thin fleece. I frantically replayed my barricade in my head. The thick butchering table, the filthy mattress, the flimsy latch. Was it enough? It had to be. It was my only defense against whoever or whatever was out there. The heavy, deliberate footsteps resumed, but they didn't head back toward the tree line, and they didn't try the door again. They began a new, terrifying pattern. Crunch, scrape, thump. They were dragging something heavy around the exterior of the cabin. It sounded like thick branches or heavy chunks of deadwood being roughly pulled across the frozen dirt and tossed against the rotting exterior walls. The rhythmic thumping began to encircle me. First the back wall, then the side opposite the door, and finally the front, right beneath the window. They were building something, or more accurately, they were piling something up. My mind raced, struggling to process the implications through the fog of pure panic and the encroaching numbness of the cold. Why wouldn't they just try to break down the door? Why pile debris against the walls? Were they trying to reinforce the cabin to keep me trapped inside until daylight? The heavy, deliberate footsteps resumed, but they didn't head back toward the tree line, and they didn't try the door again. They began a new, terrifying pattern. Then a sudden, sharp sound cut through the noise of dragging wood. It was a sharp, metallic clink. I froze, straining to identify it over the wind. It sounded like metal striking stone. Then another clink, sharper and closer this time, directly beneath the open window frame. And then I smelled it. A sharp chemical odor instantly cutting through the stench of rotting leet. Gasoline.
The harsh chemical reek of gasoline was a physical blow to my senses, instantly cutting through the sickening sweet odor of the cabin's interior. It was potent and fresh, aggressively assaulting my freezing nostrils. A primal scream died in my throat, choked off by sheer, unadulterated terror. The methodical dragging and the heavy thuds against the exterior walls finally made horrifying sense. They weren't trying to keep me in. They weren't reinforcing the cabin. They were building a pyre, and I was inside it. The panic that had been simmering in my chest exploded into a desperate, frantic need to escape. My freezing limbs, numb and sluggish just seconds before, surged with pure, agonizing adrenaline. I scrambled away from the wall, my boots slipping frantically on the damp, spongy floorboards, and threw myself toward the center of the pitch-black room. My hands blindly clawed at the darkness, desperately searching for the heavy wooden butchering table I had wedged against the door. My fingers met the cold, slick surface of the wood, and I heaved against it with every ounce of strength I had left. The table groaned, the massive legs screeching agonizingly loud against the floor, but it barely moved an inch. The mattress I had jammed on top of it was completely useless now. It was just more fuel. I shoved again, my breath coming in ragged, audible gasps, ignoring the agonizing burn in my shoulders. I was trapped in a wooden box, soaked in accelerant, with a predator waiting outside.
From just beyond the thin, rotting walls, the sickening sound of liquid splashing against the dry timber echoed through the night. Splash, splash, splash. They were systematically dousing the entire perimeter of the cabin. I spun away from the door and lunged toward the open window frame. The faint purple hue of the night sky was the only indication of where it was. I gripped the jagged edges of the rotting sill, the rough wood digging into my freezing palms, and hauled myself up to look out. The wind howled, violently whipping the pine branches against each other in the darkness. About 20 feet away, a massive, hulking shadow stood motionless in the clearing. It was completely still, a terrifyingly calm silhouette holding a heavy, rusted metal canister. The moonlight caught a brief, sickening glint of something sharp in its other hand, a machete, or a heavily chipped hatchet, just like the ones hanging on the wall inside. The shadow slowly raised the canister, the pungent smell of gasoline intensifying as it poured the remaining liquid onto the pile of deadwood stacked directly beneath the window. I stared, paralyzed, the cold wind whipping my face and freezing the sweat on my forehead. The shadow didn't move to light the fire, not yet. It just stood there, watching the window, watching me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just going to burn me alive. They wanted me to know it was coming. They wanted the terror, the slow, agonizing realization of being trapped. The smell of the gasoline was just the beginning of the psychological torture. A low, guttural laugh rumbled from the shadow, carrying easily over the wind. It was a sound devoid of any humanity, a wet, feral amusement. Then the silhouette slowly raised its hand, the machete glinting again, and pointed it directly at the window. Clink. The sharp metallic sound echoed again from beneath the sill. This time I knew exactly what it was. It wasn't metal on stone. It was the spark of a lighter. The sharp clink was instantly followed by a hollow, concussive whoomph. A blinding sheet of bright orange flame erupted outside the window, climbing the rotting exterior wall with terrifying speed. The sudden, violent illumination flooded the pitch-black cabin, casting frantic, dancing shadows across the cramped room. In the harsh, flickering light, the horrors of the space were impossible to hide. The blood-stained mattress, the rusted chains hanging from the timber, the heavy iron bear trap, everything was bathed in a hellish, shifting glow. Almost immediately, thick, oily black smoke began to roll over the windowsill, pouring into the cabin like a dark, suffocating waterfall. The sharp, toxic stench of burning gasoline and wet, rotting wood completely overpowered the smell of decaying meat. I stumbled backward, throwing my arms up to shield my face from the sudden, blistering heat radiating through the empty frame. My eyes began to stream instantly, tears cutting hot tracks through the freezing grime on my face. The damp, decaying logs of the cabin itself didn't ignite right away, but the pile of dry brush and debris he had stacked against the wall burned with a ferocious, hungry crackle. He wasn't trying to incinerate the structure in seconds. He was trying to flush me out. It was a sick, calculated game of pest control. I dropped to my hands and knees, pressing my face against the spongy, filthy floorboards where the air was marginally cooler and less toxic. Every breath was a ragged, painful gasp that tasted like ash and raw chemicals. I crawled frantically toward the center of the room, my mind spinning in a blind, agonizing panic. If I stayed inside, I would suffocate from the toxic smoke long before the flames actually reached me. But if I unbarricaded the door and ran, I would be sprinting directly into the waiting blade of a massive, feral man who knew the dark layout of these woods intimately. Over the deafening roar of the fire, a new sound cut through the suffocating atmosphere. Thud, thud, thud. He was rhythmically striking the side of the cabin with the flat of his heavy blade. He was walking the perimeter again, just outside the ring of fire, waiting for his prey to break cover. Then the taunting began. It wasn't a scream or an intimidating roar. It was a high-pitched, mocking whine that sounded entirely entirely unnatural coming from a man of his hulking size. "Help! Please, help me!" The voice was raspy, wet, and deeply distorted, perfectly mimicking the cadence of a terrified, crying woman. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me. He was imitating the owner of the slashed Osprey backpack. He was playing the sounds of his past victims back to me in my final moments. The sheer psychological depravity of it paralyzed my limbs for a crucial, burning second. "Is anybody there?" he whined again, followed immediately by that same low, guttural, feral chuckle. I choked back a sob, coughing violently as the toxic smoke bank lowered by another foot, pressing me flatter against the grime. I needed a weapon. I scrambled blindly toward the wall where the rusty tools hung, using the flickering firelight to guide my hands. My fingers blindly grasped the handle of the rusted wood saw. It was incredibly heavy, the crusty, blunted teeth biting into my palm. It was a pathetic, unwieldy defense against a machete, but it was infinitely better than dying with my bare hands. As I pulled the saw down from its rusted nail, a massive shadow eclipsed the orange glow of the firelight at the window. He was standing right at the edge of the flames, completely unbothered by the blistering heat, his face finely visible through the thick smoke. Tangled, matted hair framed a pair of wide, unblinking, dead eyes. He raised a heavy, mud-cacked boot and violently kicked the rotting wood just beneath the window frame. The entire cabin shuddered, dust and dried moss raining down from the sagging, smoky ceiling. He wasn't going to wait for the smoke to do its job. He was coming in right now.
The second kick sounded like a mortar shell detonating inside the cramped, echoing space. The rotting, weakened timber directly beneath the window frame finally gave way with a deafening crack, sending a shower of burning splinters and fiery debris directly onto the spongy floorboards. The fire outside immediately roared through the new opening, licking at the interior walls like an angry, living thing. The toxic smoke bank had dropped to waist level. I was army crawling backward, my eyes burning so fiercely I could barely keep them open, my lungs screaming for oxygen. Through the thick, swirling black haze, the massive silhouette eclipsed the flames once more. He wasn't going to the door. He was coming right through the breach. Two massive, filthy hands gripped the jagged edges of the broken window frame. His fingernails were thick, yellowed, and caked in dark grime. With a terrifying, effortless grunt, he hoisted his upper body into the cabin. Up close, the smell of him was horrific, a putrid blend of stale sweat, rancid animal fat, and the sharp chemical reek of the gasoline he had just poured. The firelight illuminated his face in terrifying detail. A thick, matted beard, skin scarred and leathered by the elements, and eyes that were completely devoid of human empathy. They were the blank, predatory eyes of a great white shark. He swung one massive leg over the sill, bringing the heavy, chipped machete up with his free hand. He couldn't see perfectly through the thick, churning smoke, but he knew I was trapped in the corner. He lashed out blindly, a brutal, sweeping arc of rusted steel intended to cleave through whatever it hit. I scrambled backward, but my boots slipped on the blood-slicked floorboards. The heavy blade slammed into the wooden wall mere inches from my skull, burying itself so deeply into the rotting timber that his hand jarred loose from the handle. It was the only opening I was going to get. Pure, unadulterated survival instinct overrode my freezing, exhausted muscles. Still on my knees, I lunged forward with the heavy, rusted wood saw. I didn't swing it gracefully. I thrust it upward like a crude spear, aiming blindly for the mass of his chest. The blunted, crusty teeth caught the thick, filthy fabric of his heavy coat and bit deep into the meat of his shoulder. He didn't scream. He let out a deep, concussive roar of pure, animalistic fury that rattled my teeth. He violently threw his bulky frame backward, attempting to rip himself off the jagged edge of the saw. The sheer physical force of his movement tore the heavy wooden handle right out of my weakened, freezing grip. I fell backward, my spine colliding painfully with the edge of the blood-stained butchering table. Above me, the dry moss he had used as insulation in the ceiling suddenly caught a stray spark.
A line of fire raced across the roof, raining burning embers down onto the horrific pile of bones and the stained mattress. The ambient heat in the room spiked to an unbearable, blistering degree. My synthetic fleece jacket was beginning to literally melt against my skin. The feral man was momentarily hung up on the windowsill, growling wetly as he yanked the rusted saw from his shoulder and blindly tossed it into the burning brush outside. He shifted his weight, reaching back for the machete that was still firmly embedded in the wall. He would have it free in seconds. I whipped my head toward the front door. It was the only way out. The roof was collapsing, the smoke was lethal, and the predator was inside. But between me and the freezing salvation of the pitch-black woods sat the 150-pound butchering table I had desperately wedged against the frame. I had locked myself in my own flaming tomb. The ambient heat was literally cooking the oxygen out of the air. My synthetic fleece jacket began to warp and shrink against my skin, emitting a noxious chemical stench that burned my eyes worse than the thick wood smoke. I had mere seconds before the burning roof collapsed entirely, or worse, before he ripped that machete free from the wall. I scrambled on my hands and knees through the blinding black haze toward the door, throwing myself against the massive blood-stained butchering table. Earlier, it had taken every ounce of my strength to push it a few feet. Now, fueled by a hysterical primal surge of adrenaline, I planted my boots on the slick, spongy floorboards and drove my shoulder into the heavy timber with everything I had left. The table groaned, the screech of wood on wood barely audible over the roaring inferno and the wet, feral growls of the man behind me. It moved. Just a foot, but it was enough. Thwack! The sickening sound of the heavy machete being violently wrenched free from the timber echoed behind me. I didn't look back. I reached up with blistered, shaking hands and fumbled with the crude iron latch. The metal was already searing hot. I ripped it upward, ignoring the burning skin on my palms, and yanked the heavy door inward. A massive, filthy hand slammed against the doorframe, inches from my head. I felt the rush of displaced air as the heavy blade cleaved the empty space where my neck had just been, burying itself deep into the thick wood of the door itself. I squeezed my body through the narrow gap, tumbling violently out of the flaming doorway and crashing down the rotting wooden steps. The physical shock of the transition was staggering. I went from 150-degree suffocating oven straight into 20-degree biting wind. The freezing air hit my lungs like inhaled shards of glass, throwing me into a violent fit of coughing. But I couldn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles screaming in protest, and faced the tree line. Without my flashlight, the forest was an impenetrable wall of absolute suffocating blackness. The raging fire of the cabin cast long, violently dancing shadows of the towering pines behind me, but running away from the light meant plunging completely blind into the void. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted into the pitch dark. I ran with my arms outstretched, desperately trying to shield my face. Thorns and dead branches whipped across my cheeks, tearing the skin, but the pain didn't register. Unseen roots grabbed at my boots, sending me stumbling and crashing through the dry brush, but I forced myself upright every time, driven by sheer animalistic panic. Behind me, the horrific symphony of the burning cabin was abruptly drowned out by a terrifying new sound. Crash! The heavy wooden door of the cabin was obliterated. He was out, and he wasn't stalking anymore. The methodical, creeping footsteps were gone, replaced by the violently heavy, rapid crashing of a massive predator sprinting in a blind rage. He was tearing through the underbrush with terrifying speed, snapping thick branches like twigs. He knew these woods in the dark. I didn't. My lungs burned. My legs felt like lead. The crashing behind me was getting agonizingly louder, closing the distance with every passing second. I braced myself for the searing pain of the blade sinking into my back. But then, beneath the roaring of my own heartbeat and the snapping of trees, I heard something else. A low, continuous, heavy roar that wasn't the wind or the fire. Water. It was the distinct, rushing sound of a large, fast-moving river. If I could reach the bank, the dense terrain might open up.
I might be able to follow the water down the mountain to a bridge or a highway. It was a microscopic thread of hope. I adjusted my blind, desperate sprint toward the sound, pushing my failing body past its absolute limit. Suddenly, the solid ground vanished completely beneath my feet.
I didn't have time to scream. The dense, thorny brush that had been tearing at my face abruptly gave way to empty, freezing air. I was airborne for what felt like an eternity before my body violently impacted the steep, muddy face of a ravine. I tumbled downward in a chaotic, agonizing blur of snapping branches and jagged rocks, my momentum entirely out of my control. The heavy, crashing footsteps of the feral man at the top of the embankment were instantly swallowed by the roar of the water below. Then, I hit the river. The shock of the glacial runoff was paralyzing. It punched the remaining air from my lungs and seized every muscle in my body. The current was brutally fast, dragging me under the black, churning surface. I fought blindly, thrashing against submerged boulders that battered my ribs and knees, desperate just to keep my head above water. I don't know how long the river dragged me. Time ceased to exist. There was only the suffocating cold, the roaring water, and the blind instinct to survive. Eventually, the violent rapids gave way to a shallower, slower bend. My boots scraped against a submerged gravel bar, and with the last dying ember of my strength, I dragged my half-frozen, bleeding body out of the water and collapsed into the freezing mud of the bank. I lay there, violently convulsing, waiting for the heavy splash of his boots entering the water behind me. I waited for the rusted machete, but the forest remained completely, terrifyingly silent, save for the wind and the rushing river. He hadn't jumped. I forced myself up. I knew if I stayed in the mud, hypothermia would finish what he started. I blindly followed the bank until the trees thinned and the faint artificial yellow glow of a street lamp bled through the darkness. It was a rural logging road. I stumbled onto the asphalt, my melted fleece clinging to my battered skin, and collapsed in the center line. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the blinding glare of approaching headlights and the screech of tires. I woke up in a regional hospital 2 days later, suffering from severe hypothermia, 3 broken ribs, a severe concussion, and dozens of deep lacerations. When I could finally speak, I told the local sheriff everything: the lost trail, the decaying cabin, the butchering table, the scattered IDs, and the feral man who tried to burn me alive inside a wooden box. They took it incredibly seriously. A massive search party, complete with tracking dogs and a helicopter, combed the deep backcountry of the Cascades. Because of my disorientation, it took them 4 days to finally locate the clearing. The cabin had burned completely to the ground, leaving nothing but a charred, smoking square of ash and the twisted, melted iron of the wood stove. There was no sign of the feral man anywhere in the surrounding woods. But a week later, the sheriff returned to my hospital room. He looked pale, his posture rigid. He told me that when the forensics team began clearing the thick layer of ash and debris to look for human remains, they found a heavy iron trap door hidden beneath what used to be the floorboards. It led to a massive reinforced root cellar dug deep into the freezing earth. The fire hadn't touched it at all. Down there, they didn't just find the remaining survival gear of the missing hiker whose ID I had found. They found dozens of backpacks, driver's licenses spanning the last 20 years, and hundreds of heavy animal traps. But the most terrifying detail the sheriff shared wasn't the trophies. It was the layout. The cellar had a secondary, narrow dirt tunnel leading away from the cabin. The police followed it for nearly a half-mile underground. It ended at a camouflaged, hollowed-out tree trunk that opened exactly 50 yards off the main marked hiking trail, right where I had stopped to take a picture. He hadn't just found me wandering aimlessly in the woods. He had been watching me step off the path, and he had been silently tracking me the entire time, herding me directly toward his front door.